Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoudé. Dean T. Alegado, a farewell.
E aloha no Dean Alegado. O Dean Tibersho Alegado ke kue o zambale zi hana no isa narsi to I milo I alamina I kale pone I pasetone o au. Ia o I ke koe ka paeo ako paeo mai ka pono la 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 hu I ka la hu I believe in hoko po e hana lima. O e moko kana kanui kana kai e. I ke mano I ke ka e a he mo I hana I ka la. Lele kau paku o ka moa I luna. Noho ia po mai kai hana anonani. Noho ia e mi hana nui. Hana ia biel moho a maho o ka moho eva. O ka o ko pa I ka lima ho I ka lapo a kanu. Na ano ka na awau na huli o ke kalo a huki a kui. He u me ke ka e o ka ku u ka hanu ma ka reo e. E o la na mamo I ka mahi e o la ko ka mo mahi.
With us to discuss and talk about the legacy of our comrade, I call him Dean Tibersho Alegado, is Davianna McGregor, Professor of Ethnic Studies and Director of Center for Oral History at Ethnic Studies, and Rosie Alegado, Associate Professor of Oceanography, both at UHM. And I am also at Ethnic Studies as well. So, Davianna, first, tell us your relationship with over all those years with
So, aloha kako. Dean Alegado came to Hawaii from California and began to teach in the Department of Ethnic Studies, first as a lecturer and then as an instructor. And then as the department gained more resources, he became a professor and then, and went through the different tenure procedures and everything and finished as a full professor. And he also, before he retired, he served as our director for several years and brought our department through many accomplishments, getting more resources for faculty to be hired, and also seeing us through the transition from a program into a full department. I'm a colleague of Dean, and we were married for 10 years. And our daughter is Rosie Alegado, who's a professor here at Associate Professor in Oceanography. And Dean then, after he retired, he returned to the Philippines with his wife and family, and was there with his parents, and they lived on their rice farm. And he then became the patriarch of their family and making sure that they were all overseen and taken care of, and the proper distribution of the rice among the family members and such. But while he was here, I was also with Dean. We both were a member of the Katipunang ng mga Demokratikong Filipino, which is for short the KDP, the Union of Democratic Filipinos, and it translates for short the KDP. And that was an organization that formed when President Marcos declared martial law in the Philippines. And so the organization formed to dedicate itself to overturning martial law that was being upheld by the United States government. So we always said it was the U.S. Marcos dictatorship, because without the support of the United States and the Air Force bases, the naval bases there, condoning the martial law status in the Philippines. That, you know, Marcos would not have had the support. So we worked many years in the movement for democracy in the Philippines, together with other faculty from the university and the large community. And it was a difficult task in this community, even though we're saying, well, there's a lot of Filipinos, they should be concerned about democracy in the Philippines. But Marcos was from Ilocos Norte, I believe. And so many of our, in our Filipino community had come from Ilocos Norte and Ilocos Sur and had familiar relationships and ties with Marcos. And so they were, you know, because he was their compadre and their relative in many ways, there was a lot of support for Marcos that we saw in Hawaii. So it was a difficult process, but ultimately, with the assassination of Benigno Aquino, we see the downfall of the Marcos anti-martial law government. And then the organization we're part of continued to work for democratic rights of Filipinos, you know, especially in second language rights and in the schools, and various immigration rights, because, you know, when in the Reagan years, there was this backlash against immigrants. So there are a lot of laws that had to be challenged. And so he worked for immigrant rights as well.
Wonderful. And Rosie, you're his daughter. So I know you from when you were like a small child.
Yes, absolutely. I grew up in the ethnic studies department. I have extremely fond memories of all of the locations from the time it was in the portables, all the way at the back of East-West Road, to moving to Korean studies, all the way to now it's at George Hall. And now my office is still at the end of East-West Road, and I feel very much close to where it once was, and I feel very comfortable there. But my decision to be a professor, I mean, it wasn't really a decision, it was a calling, was completely influenced by seeing my parents both being professors and also being surrounded by, you know, aunties and uncles who showed that what was possible for somebody who is from a historically marginalized background to be in the university. So it was so important. I consider it a privilege that I have, seeing that representation and seeing it come to life, and then having been instilled in me that it's so necessary hand in hand to pair scholarship and activism and service to community. So I really have, I was just on a talk yesterday, actually, or the other day, and you know, we talk a lot about in the scientific fields about objectivity and positivism, and how that's so hard for Indigenous people to operate in quantitative fields. And I said, you know, I never had to deal with that because I think critical theory was my foundation. So I just never even had to deal with all of the baggage associated with objectivity because it was always critical theory. And one thing that my dad always would say to me growing up was that how important it was to be a conscious element in society, to always be conscious of what was going on and who the players were, and always question, why was the system set up this way? Who was it meant to be for? And how can we strive to transform and change it? So,
yeah, we will have a segment played by John Okamura, recalling, you know, his relationship to Comrade Dean.
My first recollection of Dean was in the mid-70s, after he came to Hawaii to teach an ethnic studies program. I saw him in downtown Honolulu at 4th Street Mall. He had his megaphone, which he often used when he was speaking to crowds. And he was talking about the martial law regime of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos at that time. And then he switched to Ilocano, because Dean was Ilocano from Zambales. And he started talking to the old timers, because a lot of old timers used to gather at 4th Street Mall to talk story during those days. You know, these are guys who worked on the plantations after coming to Hawaii in the 1920s. And then he was trying to explain to them about what conditions were like under Marcos in the Philippines. And this was a real tough sell, you know, to an Ilocano audience. And that was his predicament in many ways, with the majority Ilocano population in Hawaii, boosted by post-65 immigration. The thing I reflect upon is when Dean left Hawaii to return to the Philippines, the Filipino community sponsored this big banquet at a hotel in Waikiki, and several hundred people came out to wish him well. In Filipino, it's called a despedida. That would have been inconceivable, say 25 years previously, when Marcos came to Hawaii, or going into the 80s when he came to Hawaii after being forced out of the Philippines. But so things had changed around completely for him, now being viewed very much as a community leader for a larger Filipino community, not just the anti-Marcos movement.
I want to play another segment before we go to you folks, David and Rosie. Amy Agbayani, recalling her relationship with Dean Alegado.
I first met Dean in anti-Marcos demonstrations. He was the clear leader of our Hawaii group, and because he had good national contacts as well as good contacts in the Philippines. And Dean really was able to articulate clearly in Ilocano and English the issues that we had to fight to be a good anti-Marcos movement. And so Dean was one of those people who could do everything, actually. He was able to help. We, as a community, we did brochures, and we leafleted in Kalihi. We had panel discussions. We demonstrated at the Capitol, at the airport, outside of Washington Palace, because the Filipinos in Hawaii were very, very important to the anti-Marcos effort, because Marcos, as you know, ended up living in Hawaii and dying in Hawaii. And the Filipino community in Hawaii right now is the second largest ethnic group in the state, but a significant majority of those Filipinos at the time and still are very supportive of Marcos, because he comes from the same Ilocano region as they did. So having someone like Dean quietly and competently help us was very important.
Another thing, like Davianna, we talk also about his contributions, scholarly contributions, and also contributions, and you mentioned a few things about that, to the department and the development of the department. So could you talk to that, please?
Yes, I think the ethnic studies program arose from the community and students demanding that the University of Hawaii have a history of Hawaii's people and all the ethnic groups, Native Hawaiians, Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese, and to accurately reflect the major contributions that all of our ethnic communities have contributed to the economy and to the society in Hawaii. And so ethnic studies, when we began in 1970, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary in a year-long celebration now. We had to write a lot of the histories. And so Dean did contribute to the history of the Filipino community in Hawaii through his writings, his research and his writings and his work. As the program developed, there are two periods where the university actually tried to get rid of us in periods of economic recession. So the first was right after the end of the Vietnam War, and there was a really big recession here in Hawaii. The university had recommended that we be disbanded and dismantle the program. And so we had to organize to continue the program. And that was in, I think it was in 1973, 74. Dean was not here yet. And then the next time that there was an effort to dismantle the program was in 1977, 78. And so Dean was here by then, and he was important with our whole department in organizing the community and our faculty and our alumni to put together the proposals to justify the continuation of the program. And we were able to get permanent status at that point. The next important juncture in the evolution of the program then was to achieve having a bachelor's and offering a bachelor's degree through the department. So when the program started, we were offering our degree through an interdisciplinary studies, or I think it was liberal studies. And so, you know, the students would have to pick and choose courses from ethnic studies and other courses, other departments, to put together their major. But with achieving the having our own Bachelor of Arts program, and this was under Dean's leadership at the time, then we were able to, now students could come and take and continue now to major in ethnic studies, and they can also minor in the department as well as get a certificate. And most recently, through the efforts of our Professor Rod Labrador and Monisha Dasgupta, we also have now a bachelor to master's program where you can major in ethnic studies toward a master's in education and have an accelerated program. But the foundation was laid through Dean, and it was also, we still needed additional full-time positions. A lot of our faculty were still on half-time positions because we didn't have the resources. So he was integral in working with legislators, some of whom had been ethnic studies majors or had been teaching in the department as lab leaders when they were in the university. And so Dean was instrumental in making sure that we got the resources through the legislature for those courses, and including the Black Studies course that we now have.
Yeah, Rosie, I'm sure you've read a bunch of your dad's writings. So could you say something, how that impacted you?
I mean, I think one of the ways that it most impacted me was to be able to understand the roles that Filipinos played in you know, who we are today as a multi-ethnic state. So just kind of understanding the importance of the plantation workers, you know, in their strikes on Kauai and the struggles that they went through. And then of course, you know, the evolution of a community through time. As you said, when my father first came to Hawaii, it was very difficult to penetrate into because he was very anti-Marcos and they were very pro-Marcos. And that of course was an evolution of community that had been brought as contract laborers and then, you know, kind of moved on, and then continuing to see that my father was very much interested in labor migration movements and was also very concerned with the impacts of labor happening in CNMI. He continued to be very much interested in trying to bring those issues to the fore and connecting them with, you know, immigration here as well as in the Philippines. So those issues very much resonated with me, and I think that it's very important for us to not only see Hawaii as Hawaii, but as a network to the rest of the Pacific, and to kind of see how those interactions with the Pacific and with the Philippines, how Hawaii has played a role in that. So I think understanding the greater influence of how we all interact with each other and should try to work together in the future. Now we're pivoting more towards climate change. And so it's again interesting to see how these different peoples who have been interacting with each other in the Pacific will continue to, how can we build solidarity and move forward into a collective future?
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah.
I wanted to talk about that was the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, CNMI, and because they are a Commonwealth of the United States, they can have a U.S. label for their products. And China had had built several textile factories in the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, particularly in Saipan. And because they were, so that they could get that US label, but because they were also just a Commonwealth, they didn't, at the time, they could pay less than minimum wage. And so China not only set up the textile factories there, they also had Chinese workers that were sent to Saipan. And these women who were in these like dormitories and just kind of captive in these factories. These women were working long hours under kind of penal, semi-penal conditions. If you looked at the factories, they were all behind these barbed wire fences. And so Dean was able to organize here and with people in Saipan, but especially he had to work with Senator Akaka, who was on the committee that had to do with immigration, and work with Senator Akaka to change the legislation so that the Saipan now has to pay the minimum wage. And of course, when that happened, China did close down those factories, so it had an impact on the community, but it was really, hardworking conditions for those people and almost, servitude on their part. So it really needed to be dealt with. Yeah,
That's true. I'm gonna play like 3 segments, one after the other, about impact of Comrade Dean on the department and on the people he worked with.
You could go to him with anything. In the long periods he was a chair, he was very good at listening and suggest solutions, and he actually helped me through some pretty difficult years, work-wise and also family-wise, having moved from far away from the other side of the globe to Hawaii. It was really important to have that support and understanding, and also taking time to make sure that I followed UH procedures and stuff, some of them completely new to me. So he was really instrumental in that, but he was also always ready to laugh and have fun. And that was really something that I appreciated. And his door was open, come talk, share some jokes, do something fun. He would travel, and whenever he went to the Philippines, he would always bring back little gifts to all of us. I think it wasn't just me that got them. He would bring back gifts of amazing kinds, just small things, but that he took the time and energy to think of all of us was amazing. So.
I do recall that when we were getting the AQ Aquan Naporath Fund for Social Change up and running and organizing that first event, he was very active in ensuring that went well and in connecting the right people in the community and bringing all of them together. And so the most I got to work with him on something more community focused was on the AQ, the first initial dinner, and bringing community together to honor her legacy of social justice, and to ensuring that this is something that if we're going to take on as a kuleana, as a responsibility for ethnic studies, that we do it well, and we do it in a way that is grounded in her own commitments to empowering those who are marginalized, and also with this broader view, right? Especially thinking through labor, but also all of the different ethnic groups in Hawaii that need to come together and work for social change and transformation.
So I think we found a lot of common ground in terms of both of us studying immigration, both of us being really interested in transnational circulation of labor and capital. And he was the first person who introduced me to Unite Here Local 5. He told me, I remember, him stopping at my office, and that time we were at the portables, and he said, you're sort of interested in unions and workers. So why don't you come and check out, Local 5? And, Local 5 was a very well recognized, AFL-CIO affiliated union. I was working with taxi workers and domestic workers who were more sort of following the worker center model. They hadn't affiliated. They had lots of critiques of, traditional union politics. So I kind of, went very reluctantly, kind of also sort of sharing, my reservations about traditional unionism. And, at that time, I thought all unions were sort of bureaucratic unions. His taking me to Local 5 was my first exposure to an organizing union.
Yeah, so on that, Devi, what can we say about that?
Well, it reminded me that how we got to work with Aquan McElrath. It was when we were trying to get legislation, trying to get the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union, ILWU, which represents longshore workers as well as hotel workers and plantation workers until the phasing out. But we worked with them to try to get a resolution opposing the Marcos dictatorship. And it was very difficult again because most of their workers at the time were Filipino and still are, both from the hotel sector and the plantation sector. So we worked with Aquan to try to get that resolution passed. We feel there were some repercussions from that because it brought to attention some of the cannery workers, the Cannery Workers Union in Seattle, and two of the leaders who were members of the KDP and in the ILWU leadership in the Seattle Cannery Workers Union were assassinated by the Marcos dictatorship with support of the United States. And this was documented in civil trials that followed after there were criminal trials of those who actually carried out the arrest, but there were civil trials of those who ordered the arrest and funded who ordered the assassination and who paid for the assassination. So we did that kind of work, but also in doing the work with the union, Dean worked with someone from the KDP who was in cultural arts to write a play called Timang Yuna, Those Who Led the Way. And the play depicted the struggles of the plantation workers to organize and to come together. And it's centered on a couple, actually a Filipino woman who fell in love with a Japanese man, but there were these tensions because of the 1919 strike when both Japanese and the Filipinos walked out. The Filipinos went back to work and settled first. And so there was, the play tried to depict these ethnic racial tensions within the workforce and how that played out in the organizing and how eventually, people had to come together and work and overcome those racial differences that had a lot of been promoted by the plantation itself, trying to divide the working class in Hawaii. And so it showed those racial tensions and how that was utilized in the workforce and how they eventually were overcome to organize the successful 1946 sugar plantation strike, where all the plantations and all the islands went on strike together. So it was a beautiful way to take the research he had done about plantations and the situation in organizing and working, and putting it into a popular form. And the play toured to all the islands, went to all the islands, sponsored by the ILWU, and it went to the different union halls and was performed, and really to a lot of a success, and it really became successful and popular. So that's one of the things I remember in terms of different ways to organize within the working communities and with labor. But he also then later helped to, when Local 5 had a strike, organizing students to go on and help walk the lines in support of the hotel workers as well. And ourselves, when the when when the professors went out on strike, that year the professors and the teachers both went on strike. He was our precinct leader, so to speak, or he organized the picket line down in the quarry where they entered to go to the football stadium. So he was also active in our University of Hawaii Professional Association as well.
Yeah, before I go to Rosie, I want to go to a segment from Amy's, and then I'll have Rosie comment on that.
Then we decided we really had to become permanent in many, many ways. And Dean, and of course, Davianna and others were there. So basically, I knew Davianna before she met Dean, I think. And of course, I'm very close to, I really enjoy meeting their daughter, Rosie. As you know, Rosie is now an associate professor at UHManoa, and people don't realize that she actually got the $4 million COVID lab grant that is actually helping the state of Hawaii in this time of COVID. And she's been also helping us in a number of community efforts in addition to her scholarly work. So she's following both parents. For example, just establishing the Filipino Community Center, that required federal monies as well as money from the state and the community. And so Dean did help us with the Filipino Community Center in his own way.
Yeah, so Rosie, you following after your parents. Yeah, so could you say something? Because you know why I'm saying that, because people kind of like separate between the so-called hard sciences and you know, the social sciences and humanities. And I remember you just said, like, you know, it's a matter of critical thinking that might connect both together. So could you say something about that and about the grant and how it relates to the community? I mean, not only the oceanography and social and the hard sciences. So.
Yeah. Well, I think that being raised in the ethnic studies department, and I really do consider myself being raised there. I remember going there very much a lot after school, and you know, kind of being a mini TA for my parents, having to, you know, make lots of copies for their class and do all the handouts and kind of help them. You can't help but kind of soak in all of the teachings and the theory and the theoretical frameworks. And, you know, during the summertime, also being around for all of the teacher institutes and having the benefit of going on all the geopolitical tours and the field trips. So it really was it really is second nature to want to do things in service to community and to do things for the community. I think that's really how I was raised by my parents, is to, you know, my parents are grassroots organizers, and their philosophy was, we just take you, well, if I wasn't going to my grandparents' house, I was going out with them. I was also on the picket line, you know, I was also going out to all of these events. So it wasn't anything that I felt like I had to step very far outside of my comfort zone to do. Trying to help the community is really what I was raised to do by my parents. And so when COVID happened, or is continuing to happen, I immediately felt that we needed to, I had been looking at what was happening on the continent and seeing that there were all these mutual aids. I had seen that there were these universities, specifically University of Washington and UC Berkeley, who had leveraged the expertise that they had on campus to begin to provide more testing capacity for their communities. And I immediately saw that Hawaii was going to be, because we're always at the end of a very long global supply chain, I knew that we were going to be under capacity and under resourced on the one hand, and on the other hand, all it would take would be a small group of tourists to come in with the disease to really ravage our local communities. And we had low capacity in the hospitals. And so I felt that it was very critical that we could use this motivation and example of these schools on the continent, schools that were public universities just like us, that had resources just like us, to begin to mobilize and create these opportunities. So when I put out the call and I saw who was willing to help, and there was one other professor who's Dr. Vivek Nurkar, he's the chair of the tropical medicine department, and he said, yeah, let's do this, I want to do this too. And it was scary because I didn't have all of the expertise it took to know what it even meant to set up a clinical lab. And we're good partners because, number one, he had the expertise and I had really great community connections, to be honest, because of my parents and because of the ethnic studies department and all the good work that had been done. And so people were very much willing to help us. And so when the opportunity came, and again, this is just experience of having written so many grants to try and fund my work. As we all know, as scholars, we have to do. That experience really came in handy and leveraged, and we were able to write a grant to see what it could take. And so our clinical lab is based at JABSUM, and it's very unique to other clinical labs. So when you go to the doctor, you might get your blood drawn, right, for diabetes or to see if you have high cholesterol. And those tests get run at two major labs on Oahu. It's either DLS, Diagnostic Lab Services, or CLH, Clinical Labs Hawaii. And the JABSUM Tropical Medicine Clinical Lab is not in the business of doing those. Our purpose is really only to, number one, for this pandemic, to serve and provide increased health access to the people of Hawaii, and then to use the fact that we are interfaced with researchers at UH to prepare for the coming new emerging infectious disease threats that are on our horizon. And so we do things that other clinical labs don't do. So for example, we have done over 26 outreach events where we have leveraged our connections with communities. So we test at public housing. We test regularly at like Palolo Public Housing. I was just there this Saturday to help test residents, primarily who are new immigrants, right? They're Pacific Islanders, they're Vietnamese, who normally might be underinsured or just have poor access or have distrust. And so, I took the lessons that I've learned from my parents and other people at ethnic studies, in order to there's natural distrust, which makes sense from historical, medical inequalities and problems with many of these communities. I took what I learned from my parents and I built these trust relationships with partner organizations who are already servicing the communities. So I've made partnerships with the local churches, with the Filipino community, with other groups who are already servicing these people. And so, for example, working with Auntie Amy, we partnered with the Filipino Cares Community Project. So we tested out not only at the PhilCom Center, we also provided testing at Catholic churches across the island of Oahu. And these are the kinds of out-of-the-box thinking, I think, that is really necessary to be able to really protect our communities and provide that kind of access that is necessary to keep us all safe. So, I think it's really important because it shows that you can have technology and science serve the people, but it has to be with the community. Of course, you cannot do research on community. You cannot do research to the community. And that's a very important aspect as I guess, as you keep calling it, hard science kind of STEM researcher, is that it's very easy. And I think there's been a long and not great historical legacy of people not doing things in consultation with community or for them, and not understanding what the real issues are. And that's why it's so important to marry those efforts with the things that, like critical theory, because we can then go to the communities and see what is the problems that they believe that is most important to them, and what can we do to bring our technology and science to help them out.
Yeah, wonderful. Before I go to Davy, I just want to run one more segment. And just my comment on the science, technology, engineering, and math is that through civic engagement, ethnic studies is active in having the relationship between community and STEM. So before we go to Davy, I want to go to a segment by John Okamura. We play that and come back.
Dean spent his sabbatical at the legislature essentially as a lobbyist for Gina Wakuni to get legislators behind funding the building of UH West Oahu. And that was successful. And so the campus was eventually built. And what it resulted in was this really increased enrollment of Native Hawaiians and Filipinos to college. They're the two largest groups at UH West Oahu. And Filipinos, and their enrollment has continued to increase almost every year since the campus was built, compared to their underrepresentation historically, continues to the present at UHManoa. So by his efforts at the legislature during his sabbatical too, he sacrificed his own sabbatical to do this. Dean contributed to the access to college of Filipino and Native Hawaiian students, and this will continue, I have no doubt, at UH West Oahu because of the population of those communities on that part of the island. When Dean came to Ethnic Studies 75, there was already a Filipinos in Hawaii course because I met the person, Evelyn Hernandez, who was teaching it. And, but Dean really made it a very popular course, and he continued to teach it until he left, and, perhaps for 30 years over that time. But I think one of his really lasting contributions is developing the ethnic identity course. He was the one that introduced that course, which continues to be taught every semester and has become one of the most popular courses that we offer. But my personal connection also with Dean in terms of the department was he was the first one among the faculty who invited me to give a guest lecture in that course, the ethnic identity course, which I eventually also taught regularly. And this happened after I came back to Hawaii in '83. I was unemployed, looking for a job, and Dean contacted me and asked me to give a lecture on local identity in his course. So that was kind of like one of my first connections, besides with Franklin Odo, with the department. Certainly the first time I lectured in an ethnic studies course. So I really appreciated that gesture he made at that time. But I also can mention his contributions to Philippine studies at the UHManoa campus, because he served as director, I think, maybe around 2006, I think around the time of the 100th anniversary of Philippine immigration to Hawaii. I might have got that wrong, but I know he raised a lot of money to hold events in celebration of that event. And he kind of straddled Filipino American studies / ethnic studies and Philippine studies through his research and writings. His dissertation was on international Philippine labor migration, for example.
Yeah, I think, Dean was at heart a nationalist, a Philippine nationalist. Even though before coming to Hawaii, he had been raised in California. He was born in the Philippines, and he spent, his best years in the Philippines growing up, and always returned with his parents there. So he had always intended to be able to go back and retire in the Philippines and to do work there in his community and among his family, of course, in the San Narciso in Zambales. And so he did for a time lead the Philippine Studies program. And as John pointed out, he was looking at labor migration out of the Philippines, not only to the US and Hawaii, but also to Saudi Arabia and to other parts in Asia, Singapore, and the remittances that were being sent back to the Philippines, so that even though the Philippine economy was not as prosperous as other economies in Asia, that because of the labor remittances that were being sent back, it was artificially supporting and infusing the Philippine economy and giving it a sense of prosperity because of the labor service that remittances that Filipinos were doing in other parts of the world. So I think his studies on transnational migration are quite a breakthrough to understand that role, that the important role that overseas Philippine workers play in the internal, even though they're external, they become part of the internal economy in the Philippines. So his work in that way straddled Filipino Americans as well as the Philippines. And he understood that, you know, the Filipinos are in a diaspora and continue to maintain very strong ties with the homeland. And so, you know, the whole question of identity as Filipinos in coming to Hawaii it's very much into more a diasporic identity of adjusting to a new society, but also maintaining that pride and identity in their homeland, and feeling that nationalism to really identify, you know, so many of the people that came involved in the anti-Marcos movement were Philippine immigrants, but they felt this great loyalty and connection to their people in the Philippines to uplift them, that they became very active in trying to, you know, overthrow that fascist regime and reinstate a democracy.
Okay, wonderful. I'm gonna go to Tai Tengan's segment, and then we'll talk more.
You know, he was writing about the ways in which the Filipino community in Hawaii was both its own distinct group, but also still very connected with other communities in the Philippines, as well as more broadly in the US and in the Pacific. I know at least in the Pacific, I believe one of the articles he co-authored was on Filipino labor in Palau. I might need to go double check on that one. But it was with that notion that these connections continue in important ways that are not only about remittances and sending money back, but the ways in which communities thrive and are interconnected and interdependent across space and time. And this is, I think, an approach that really helped us as we were later, after he left, but I think partly in debt to his thinking, trying to conceptualize an Oceanic ethnic studies, which is also very much about communities across space and time, but still connected in important ways, and for us by Oceania, by the Pacific, which, as was the case and still remains the case for Filipinos, Filipinx communities, really a connective force, and helps us, I think, to also maintain that global perspective while also really honoring and supporting local struggles.
Yeah, so I wanna go to Noel Kent before we go to Davianna.
He was an excellent chair. I think he, again, very, you know, his qualities, the fact he was empathetic and open to, you know, various colleagues, and open to, I mean, you know, you never had a sense that if you approached him in his office or someplace else, you were not welcome. And so I think he was a really exceptional chair, and you know, he devoted the time and the effort it needed to, you know, to the chairmanship, and he, you know, he kept us going. And you know, those were years when, you know, the ethnic studies program has always been imperiled by certain forces, and anybody who's chair, and you know, you were chair for a while, Ibrahim, and you know that it's a real challenging job. You basically have a number of different masters to satisfy, and yeah, the administration, and also the faculty and our faculty, and also we work with outside communities, so there's that too. And Dean could work with everybody. I mean, that's part of his leadership and the gifts that he brought to the leadership, that he could work with community people, he could work with colleagues, he could work with administration too, and they respected him, and they took him very seriously as our leader, and that made a huge difference to the success and the the ability of the department to sustain itself. So Dean gets a lot of credit for the fact that we are still, there, and we are still doing the teaching and carrying out the mission that we've always had. So that was, and in terms of courses, yeah, we overlapped on some courses, I think, like identity and a few other courses. And once in a while, if I needed some help, I would ask, to maybe to look at his syllabi just to see what he was doing. And he was always very, very happy to share and to make suggestions if he felt that I was asking for suggestions.
Yeah, Davy, and then we ask Rosie. Briefly, though, because we are running out of time.
Yeah, I think, in our department, we do a lot of talking in our hallways. And I remember Dean loved popcorn. The smell of popcorn always emanated from his room, and he'd bring it to our meetings. And so it just was a way of warmth that we all felt very warm and comfortable, and we could all sit around and eat popcorn and talk about our problems and how we're going to solve them. But he was, instrumental, as I say, when we lose the professor, the professor goes away, it's always a challenge. How do we retain that position? And he was, because he worked so well with so many people in the community and in the university, we were able to retain those positions, the Japanese course position, the Chinese course position, and importantly, the Black Studies course position.
Yeah, popcorn did its duty. Yeah. Rosie, anything?
Well, I'm laughing because I just had my popcorn snack before we started. So popcorn's one of my favorite ones too. And I was thinking I should take some popcorn to work, and maybe it's a good way to make some new friends. But I really have taken my dad's leadership style as a model. One thing that I have learned, and I think is that it is very important to try and work with everybody across campus, and particularly being in SOAS, I have used that as an opportunity to build bridges with other colleges and universities that haven't. So the example that I can provide is that we have had a really large outcry from the Black Indigenous people of color in the marine sciences, and much of that is rooted in the lack of cultural competency in SOAS. And because of the importance of doing that, I was able to reach out to the Ethnic Studies program, who have really come and help us, invited us to come attend your talks and seminars, and also have been guests at our departmental seminar. And I think really illustrating that importance of standing together, and especially as we're going into these times of budget crunch and crisis, it's so important that we have solidarity with one another. And I know that recently there was somewhat of a threat to the Ethnic Studies program, and I was able to get my Oceanography colleagues to rally around and support and say they helped us become a better department, and we have to stand by them. And I think that is the kind of ethos that we really need to cultivate at the University of Hawaii and just any educational institution.
Okay, wonderful. I'm gonna play another segment, Ula, and then Noel, and then we will wrap up by asking you a few things. Okay, we go.
Of course, I would be using his texts in my class. Not only because he was the chair of the department that I was teaching for, but because they were well done, very well researched, and also not dogmatic, not too square. It was kind of opening up for community experiences and written in a way that appealed to students. His scholarship was important for the whole development of ethnic studies, I think. I think to me it was a bit of a shock that he decided to leave, but I also fully understand his family relationship. But I do think that he did as much as he could to have everything on track when he left. So it wasn't like he left unfinished business in that way. And he probably thought that we could easily handle or do fine in the future. And we did. We have some really great faculty now with that specialization that he had.
if Dean was here, I would say, Dean, it was a great pleasure to know you, and to work with you was a gift to work with you all those years. And I never saw you that I didn't feel that your presence and your persona comforted me, and it gave me a sense of belonging. And I want to thank you for that. You were a wonderful colleague, and you gave our department leadership when it needed it, and you impacted the lives of hundreds and hundreds of students. And that's your legacy right there.
So Rosie, how does that grab you, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I had the very much the pleasure and the aloha to take care of my dad at the end part of his life. And I think he really, even though he decided to go back to the Philippines, he always knew he had a home here in Hawaii, and a part of his life would always be here in Hawaii. And I think that's why also he came back. And just so emblematic of who he was, even though he was nearing the end of his life when ethnic studies was under threat, he still was able to dictate to me his testimony for the Board of Regents and really emphasize and remind them. I think he really reminded the Board of Regents their commitment to the ethnic studies program and the impact that the ethnic studies program had and has had and will continue to have on the people of Hawaii. So I think that my dad really knew that his legacy was firm in everybody that he left behind, from his students to his family.
Yeah, great. And Davy, I wanted also to ask you about the last testimonial that Dean did for ethnic studies.
Yeah, it was amazing because he was, undergoing chemotherapy treatment, and he was very particular and intentional in making a statement to the Board of Regents that we can't phase out our or stop out our bachelor's program, which he had established, of course, but to remind them of the importance of ethnic studies to the University of Hawaii, and to because of the communities that have come together and are represented through the histories and the courses that we teach, and it's so important to the multi-ethnic students of our university. So that was really important. I just want to say that Jean has always been one of my best friends, and we've always been working together in all the efforts for the Philippines, for Hawaii, and for our students. So I do miss him, but I'm so glad that he was able to retire early and enjoy, ultimately what he wanted to do is to go back to the Philippines to live. And if he had retired, like I still haven't retired, if he had waited to retire like me, he wouldn't have had the chance and opportunity to live with his parents and live, go back to the rice farm and live in the Philippines. So I'm so glad that he was able to have that part of his life and a good part of his life.
Good. So he was versatile in his talents, and he contributed, his contribution were multifaceted, and his legacy remains and it shall be a guiding force for all of us. Well, we wrap it up. Mahalo nui loa. Thank you, and for our viewers, and we'll see you next month. Aloha.
We also established a connection with UCLA, the Asian American Studies Center. And so Dean was the chair when we took over that program in, I think, about 2003. And then the enrollment just multiplied hugely. I mean, I remember we had more than 40 students from UCLA coming every summer to take courses with ethnic studies students. So that was I think, a major kind of contribution that Dean led at that time in terms of expansion of the department.
Dean was a wonderful human being. There were so many battles that we fought with the administration, that our life wasn't easy. But, from securing positions from the legislature to, moving us from those temporary portables to George Hall, I never saw Dean lose his cool. I never saw him say a bitter word to anybody, but at the same time, he stood his ground. And that is what amazed me. Like, how do you do that? I don't know how to do that without like crumpling up my face and becoming very angry. But I never saw Dean, do that while, quietly with good humor and always, sort of building a team spirit.